Welcome to the Road to Accountable AI. I'm Kevin Werback, professor of legal studies and business ethics at the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania. For decades, I've studied emerging technologies from broadband to blockchain. Today, artificial intelligence promises to transform our world. But AI won't reach its potential without accountability, mechanisms to ensure it's deployed in responsible, safe, and trustworthy ways. On this podcast, I speak with the experts leading the charge for accountable AI. Suresh Venkatasubramanian is a professor of computer science and data science at Brown University, who served as assistant director for science and justice at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy in the Biden administration. Fast Company named him to their AI 20 list of thinkers shaping the world of generative AI. We talk about the effectiveness and limitations of algorithmic fairness techniques, the significance of the Biden administration's blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights, subsequent developments in AI policy in the US and elsewhere, why computer scientists and others need to go beyond merely responsible AI, and whether we can build the necessary institutional trust to successfully address AI's challenges. Suresh, welcome to the Road to Accountable AI.
Thanks for having me, Kevin.
You've worked for a number of years as a computer scientist, among other things, on issues of algorithmic fairness. So how far along are we in terms of technical capabilities? If a company uses best practices today in terms of debiasing training data and models and outputs, should they be reasonably confident that problems about bias can be addressed?
I think most companies today could be reasonably confident that with the right people in place and the right teams, there's a whole suite of tools, ideas, concepts they can rely on to do a pretty good job in putting out products that they can be proud of that are indeed mitigating various forms of bias. I think we're not, I would say, 100% of the way there yet.
Where are the biggest gaps?
I think the gap as such is really in going from what I'll call more sort of bespoke, boutique, sort of specific things that have been known to work in different cases to a general set of prescriptions that is both general enough to cover all the different issues that might come up, but specific enough that can be tailored to any organization's own needs. And I think that's where I just came back from a workshop where we were talking about, this idea of bridging predictions and interventions and this issue of where the rubber meets the road and how you actually operationalize these ideas that are out there is, I think, where the last mile sort of problem is, I guess.
But do you think that we'll get there? Is it a research problem, or is it more about translating what computer scientists are doing to actually be useful for organizations?
I don't think it's a translation. I think of translation as I've said the correct thing and now I need to translate to your language. I think it's more of a conversation. I think we are having those conversations in various places, but the conversation has to be something like, okay, here's my organization with my specific concerns, or rather, here's my organization and I've heard about these issues, I'm worried about them. And then someone in their organization can say, all right, let's break it down. What are your concerns? Where are the things you want to prioritize? Okay, now here's a bunch of tools we can bring in. Let's deploy them in. Let's build a governance structure around them. Let's see what results we're getting. Let's adapt. So that conversation, we have the pieces for each of it. But I find myself constantly saying, okay, this is just what I just told you right now. This is what you need to do. You need to build a team. You need to think about values. You need to think about implementations. You need to think about monitoring and so on. So I think there is research that is going to be teed up from those conversations. And as an academic, I want to hear more about this conversation so that we know what questions we should be asking and trying to answer. But those conversations are key. And having those conversations in a way that some of it can be surfaced in the public domain is also key.
How much has the rise of generative AI changed the way that you would answer those questions?
At one level, it has not at all. Another level, it has confused everything. And I think it has confused everything at, say, the C-suite level, where suddenly executives are very panicked about generative AI and want to make sure they're ahead of the curve or they're not being left behind. So there's a lot of push within organizations. So we need to Gen AI our whole company. So put it in everywhere, right? And I think the problem is that no one really knows what that means. And I think I've been hearing from people that once they actually sort of get down to it, roll up their sleeves and say, okay, what does it mean to bring in generative AI into our organization? They realize a whole bunch of risks, a whole bunch of concerns, a whole bunch of vulnerabilities that they can get exposed to if they do that. And so then they have to say, well, wait a second, I have to think about this. In the meantime, though, all the other places where organizations have been using AI, or what I'll call predictive AI as opposed to generative AI, those issues still remain, and we still need to be concerned with them. But because all of these get lumped together under the rubric of AI, the confusion and the panic about generative AI is causing unreasonable confusion and panic about predictive AI, where we know a ton more. And I think that's something where I find myself often having to say, there's this kind of AI tools, there's that kind. You're using a lot of that kind, and we can do a lot there. You're getting panicked about this kind. That's a whole different discussion we should have.
Yeah, so I'm interested in that question about where you said we know a lot more about the predictive models. So if I am deploying a supervised machine learning system, I've got data scientists and use various algorithms and tools to have some sort of fairness function be put on the outputs. What's different if I'm using a large language model or a foundation model like a GPT?
Fundamentally, if you're using a large language model or some other foundation model, unless you've built the model yourself, which is highly unlikely, you're using a model that's come from somewhere else. Either it's an open source model that you brought into your system, or it's an API based access to ChatGPT or GPT-4 or 4.0 or something like that. You no longer have full, if you haven't built in-house, which for the vast majority of people is true, you no longer have control over the system that you're actually working with, which in contrast to, say, a supervised learning system that you build in-house, you may not understand all the details of why it's producing outputs, but you have full control over the data, over the training, over the model. So that's one problem. Secondly, we don't have really good tools to do any kind of mitigation or intervention in generative AI systems, which means if I try to evaluate the behavior of such a system and I want to check for various kinds of biases, it's a lot harder to do that because the space of possibilities where it can perform a certain way is much larger because it's really about natural language prompts. Unless I have a very controlled set of prompts and I only allow those access to it and I test that rigorously, it's really hard to understand what the system is doing. And if I discover some problems, it is really hard to figure out what to do about it at that point. So most of the framework and the tools we built up that work well with predictive systems, whether it's fairness mitigations, whether it's explanations, whether it's bridging this gap between prediction and interventions, those don't work anywhere near as well or at all in some cases with foundation models. And we're in a position now where we have to rebuild our understanding of those systems.
So you spent 2 years, I believe, at the White House in the Office of Science and Technology Policy working on AI issues. Let me ask you first, generally, what was your experience as an academic coming into that environment?
Well, you say 2 years, it was actually 1.25, but it felt like 10. So, who knows what that means. So it was quite a different experience. I mean, I'd done a little bit of, I guess, dipping my toe into the lake of policy work at the state and local level. So I had a teeny bit of exposure, but it was nothing like what had actually happened when I showed up in DC at the White House. There are many ways in which policy work is like academic work, and there are many ways in which it's totally different. And I had to figure out, which of my skills I could transfer over and which I had to rebuild and just come up and learn brand new things. So in one way, it's great. You're a professor for a while. You think, okay, every day is going to look the same as every next day. And then suddenly you get thrown into an environment where you feel like a first year. I kept telling people I felt like first year grad student again, and that was kind of fun and intense. But yeah, it takes a lot. You learn a lot very quickly. Otherwise, if you want to survive, you have to.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I find, I'm curious your take that people don't necessarily understand about the U.S. and the White House is obviously the White House is this incredibly powerful institution, and there are many people who are working for different parts of the White House or the executive branch, but relative to the incredible breadth of issues that come before it, it's actually really tiny. The number of people that are engaged in any particular area is pretty small. So I'm curious, what you felt like being part of OSTP, engaging on these AI issues, and how much the people that you were with were able to actually move the needle.
Yeah, I mean, it's very true. The White House is very small. I think OSTP, in its role as a convener of science and tech policy work across the federal government, had a much broader view of who was doing what where. So in that sense, I was, dealing very quickly with the full complexity of the entire U.S. government, or at least those people thinking about AI. Which in every agency was so many people who were thinking about this and trying to do a good job of it. So I got a much bigger view, but you're right that within the White House itself, in terms of change making and advocating for change, it's a small group of people you have to work with and understand the network structure within. So that takes some getting used to, and just understanding all the relationships that we built up, all the key players, and often titles tell you a little bit, but don't tell you a lot about who's an important actor in the space and whose ear you need to bend, for some issues. So that takes some learning to do. But yeah, the breadth of issues being covered is vast, which means that, again, and this is different from being an academic, where as an academic, you specialize in some area and you become very, very good in a special area. When you're working in government and you're working at that level, you have to be a generalist. So you have to be able to suppress that constant feeling of, I don't quite know exactly what I'm doing here. I don't know. I'm not the expert on this, and someone else must be. And do the best you can. Reach out to expertise when it's appropriate. Sometimes you can reach out to outside experts. Sometimes you can't, based on the rules around what you're doing. But you have to do the best you can. I think a lot of policy work is engineering that way. You do the best you can with what you have right now at the moment. You can't wait for this perfect solution to appear. You don't. That's not a luxury you have in the policy work.
What was the function or vision for the blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights, which was really one of the central things that you were involved with developing there?
The premise, I think, was that, coming into the Biden administration, it was, becoming very clear that questions around AI, especially work questions around AI in society, were going to be central to the administration's thinking about race and equity within the government, about, how to think about tech policy more broadly as these questions were surfacing. And so, but there wasn't a very clear articulation of what is it we should be caring about, right? There were different ways to think about it. I mean, the EU had started their process by then already, and they were well into their process for the AI Act, and different groups were putting out their own arguments about what to be thinking about. A lot of that was very centered around the technology itself. A lot of it was centered, okay, here's a piece of tech, here's what you should do. I think the vision inside OSTP that folks were, thinking about was, what does it mean to center, you know, people's rights and impacts on people first, and think about the technology second, right? And that, I think, so in many ways, a shift from how the discourse was happening around tech, but a shift that needed to happen. And so the overall effort to generate the blueprint was to say, if government isn't the job of, understanding what people need, understanding and protecting people, even from themselves, and what does that look like in an AI powered society? What rights should people have as we barrel towards this algorithmic future? And that was the genesis of the work that led to the blueprint.
Uh, could you summarize what the blueprint accomplished?
Well, the blueprint had sort of 5 things in it, easy to state things that, any AI systems or any technology that affects our lives in any material way, our rights, our opportunities, our access to vital services, should be safe and effective. It should work, and it should work for the purpose it was intended. They shouldn't discriminate. They should use our data very sparingly, if at all. They should be transparent and accountable, and we should know how they work and why. And we should have, what I like to call dial zero for operator, right? If you have a backup option, have a way to sort of talk to an actual person, so you're not constantly relying on going back and forth between different pieces of technology or chatbots or whatever. That's it. The rest of the document really is about how you go about doing this and why we need these in the first place. So I think there are 2 key parts to what makes this document, not 3 pages, but 75 pages, which is really making the case for why these principles are important, right? A lot of people are like, well, that all sounds great, but who cares? And then, so one of the things the document does is document very clearly what happens or what has happened in the past with evidence when one of these principles, these rights, gets abrogated. And so that was a part of the document. Another part, and this was very important to us since we were, computer scientists sitting in OSTP, saying none of this is a pie in the sky ideal. None of this is, crazy stuff that no one can do. This is real. This is practical. This could be done right now. and here's how. And so listing out a bunch of different things that you could do and questions you need to focus on, some of which would need new research, but some of which could be done today. And so that was what the document had. In terms of impact, it's been almost 2 years in now, and I think I would say that the major impact the document has had, and that's been personally pleasantly surprising to me, really also, is how it has changed the discussions around how we talk about AI in society. Right? It has done exactly what it set out to do, which is put a marker for how the government views the role of the government, of regulation, of protections for people in the age of AI. And you can see the DNA of the blueprint in the executive order, in the OMB guidance, and a bunch of state legislation, in the number of states that have called for their own AI Bill of Rights. And that's sort of a pleasing thing to see, I think.
Is it still relevant and useful after Biden administration executive order, NIST risk management framework, potential legislation, and so forth? Is there still a value in the blueprint?
Oh, definitely. Because I think one thing that has become very clear, and that was clear when the document was being written, was that it was a first step, not a last step. Right. So it laid out these principles. And if you notice, when I said technology, I wasn't very specific about AI. It applies to all kinds of systems, which means that in some degree, not in every degree, but in some degrees, it's future proof. It says, when you have new systems that are going to make decisions about our lives, or assistant decisions about our lives, these are the principles you need to have. I don't care if it's generative AI. I don't care if it's predictive. I don't care what it is. And I think to that extent, as new technology is coming out, as new things are coming out, it's very easy to go back to the blueprints. Okay, how should we care about this? It's still there and it's still valuable. So I think it is continuing to be a reference point for organizations, for governments, and for students, and for people thinking about AI in society broadly. And that's very, very powerful.
What's your view about the executive order that was subsequently issued by the Biden administration?
I think it's quite good. I think it covered a lot of different areas. It was a very long executive order, I believe almost the longest in history. That is what it is, but it also shows that that you needed to have something elaborate, because this area is so complicated and touches so many different parts of government. So I think the administration, and I wish say I had nothing to do with the putting out of the executive order or the drafting of it. So just saying that up front, I think it did a good job in covering all the different areas that people had been concerned about and trying to make progress on them. And we've seen since then, the 90-day deadlines, the 180-day deadlines, all the things that have been happening. We've seen the OMB guidance come out, being quite solid in its own right. I think there are obviously, again, there are places where it could have done better. And there are places where we would hope that more would come. I think there are big gaps, for example, in thinking around criminal justice, and thinking about law enforcement more broadly and its intersection with national security. There's obviously the national security memo that will eventually, in some form, some of it will be classified, some of it might appear. So there's things that can be done. But I think that's the point, right? It's a constant process of refinement. And the blueprint said, okay, here's what we need to do. The executive order said, okay, here's how we need to concretize this. The OMB guidance says, here's how we need to concretize it even more specifically. And I expect this to keep happening. I think if we just sit back and say we're done, that'll be the mistake. We're not done.
Yeah, and it frustrates me somewhat, and I would guess probably you too, when people dismiss what's happened in the U.S. and say, well, there's no enforceable comprehensive AI law, and therefore all of this is just principles. But it sounds like what you're saying is that at least there has been a good response to the blueprint and understanding that there's a lot more to it than that.
Yeah, and I think, Congress is working on what Congress will work on. States are working on things. Colorado just passed, I think, what would be regarded as the first comprehensive AI accountability legislation, which is not bad at all. Other states are doing this. California is working on one of their own, and so it's happening, I think, and that momentum is very important. I think people don't realize that we tend to want the shiny thing, the one thing that will solve all our problems. Government is complicated, society is complicated. You shouldn't expect, in fact, the only way for these things to work is to bring everyone along, which means bring governments along, bring the private sector along, bring companies along who put out their own completely voluntary guidelines that they will follow, where people could say, well, no one's forcing you to do it, why are you going to do it? But they're going to do it anyway, because companies want to make sure that they are not doing things where they could get into trouble later, or where it could affect their brand or affect their image, as you know so well. I mean, people are going to do this, and the trick is to bring everyone on board and bring them along for the ride, rather than saying that we need the one, shiny thing that everyone will follow. and that's complicated. It looks multidimensional. It looks tricky. It looks like NIST. It looks like responsible AI practices within a company. It looks like what the IAPP is putting out. It looks like all these things together. Each one of them is not going to solve all the problems, but together they can.
Hmm. I mean, what's most important to create that alignment of incentives? Because you're right, just the fact that companies don't have legally enforceable obligations doesn't mean that many of them don't actually want to and take serious action. But there are cases where there are gaps when there isn't enforcement. So, do you have any thoughts about what from a design standpoint, or from what comes out of places like the White House that can align those incentives properly?
I think it's hard to align incentives only with carrots. You do need some
Hmm.
sticks. There's no way around that. I know a lot of the tech sector is advocating for purely voluntary guidelines. They will not work. Not because companies are evil and are going to do bad things. It's just that, again, ultimately, if you're in the business of running a business, your goal is to generate profits for your shareholders, and that is going to take priority. And if you don't have a forced incentive to do the right thing, you're going to try to find ways to do as little as possible, and that's not doesn't make you bad. It just makes you a natural creature of your own incentive. So you do need some sticks. So I think the role of government is critical. The role of the regulatory agencies is critical. But I think that itself won't be enough, right? If the only thing stopping us from robbing our neighbors was the police, that would not work. There aren't enough police to stop us from robbing our neighbors. It's also just that we don't hope all of us don't want to do that. We just don't think it's the right thing to do. And I think as an academic teaching students who are going out and working at these companies, part of my theory of change is we just need to play the long game as well and just change how we think about deployment of AI systems so that in a future very close by now, not putting out a system that has safeguards and bias mitigation will seem like the dumb thing to do. And that anyone putting out a system like, what, are you crazy? You didn't put bias mitigation, which is what we do now with other kinds of testing. If you put out a system that doesn't do some basic unit testing, your software, your project manager is going to like, why are you nuts? I want to have that same are you nuts reaction for guardrails and responsible AI practices as well, so that it just becomes a matter of course. And I think we can get there.
Obviously, the European Union has a somewhat different approach, or at least in terms of the order that they have the AI Act that has been adopted. That's a very detailed, comprehensive, prescriptive law. So what do you think they got right, and what do you think they got wrong?
I think there's a lot they got right. I think they were, you've got to give them credit. They were the first ones to pass
Mm-hmm.
a law, and everyone outside the US and maybe even within the US is going to sort of adjust what they're doing now based on the AI Act. A lot of countries are looking at what the AI Act looks like, and they're trying to shape their own laws. They're trying to say, okay, we're going to work with the EU. We need to adjust accordingly. So there's a lot that's good in there. I think they had some struggles with their, scoping, the definition of AI. I think there's a lot more to be seen about how their own government office that they're going to set up to do some of this evaluation auditing plays out. So I think it's early to say how this will work. I think there's some good signs, and we just have to wait and see.
Hmm. What does it take to going forward when there is legislation get academics and others from the private sector to engage in working through some of those issues?
I mean, it's hard, right? Because on the
Yeah.
for one thing, you would like academics, for example, to work in government, like for people to work at NIST, at the AI Safety Institute, right? Tech Congress has put out this ad for people to help with AI safety work. And if you're getting like a salary of I don't know, roughly $3 gajillion to go work in Silicon Valley, it's hard to go work with the government for much less. So that's one problem, I think, at least in the US. The economic incentives for undergrads. I mean, I talked to a lot of students who they would love to go work in AI for society, but the kind of salaries they see just working in Silicon Valley are very high. That's one thing. I think just timing. If you're working as an academic in an institution, if you're pre-tenure, for example, it's very hard to do this kind of work. If you're post-tenure, maybe you can. But then the funding sources, figuring all these like logistical details can be tricky to do. I think also it's hard because, as I said, right, you need to be very specific for an organization as to what they need, which means almost you need to be embedded within an organization or have very close understanding of that organization, um, which which means either that you're working for that company or you're consulting with them in some way. But then you also have to work with government or talk to people who work in government. And so some of these communication pathways are hard to navigate. You can't always speak freely about what you want to sort of understand. So there are a lot of, I think, challenges to creating the open lines of communication that are needed to share knowledge about what is worked, right? I'd love to sort of say, oh, I'm working at company A doing this. Hey, you at company B, what have you been doing? Can we share knowledge about this? And there was a little bit of that happening. Even about a couple of years ago, there were folks in Silicon Valley, all the responsible AI teams who were talking to each other about these things. But then again, various things happened. Tech companies decided to retrench, and those teams are dispersed. And right now, I obviously don't know how well those teams are connected now. But you need those kinds of that knowledge sharing as well to happen.
So, since returning to academia, you started a center at Brown on some of these issues, and I am curious. It's the Center on Technological Responsibility, Reimagination, and Redesign.
Yep.
So, responsibility, I think I understand. What's the reimagination and redesign parts?
I'm very glad you asked that, because that's very important to me. Those the other parts of this. So I think we all understand what tech responsibility looks like, and putting in the right guardrails, the right protections. But as a computer scientist, I think that we have an opportunity to not just design protections around systems that are already out there, but reimagine and redesign systems that are sensitive to and address the needs of all people from the get-go. For decades, I think computer science has viewed itself as a discipline that is sort of people-free, right? We build the tools, we throw them out there. We don't worry about what happens once we throw them out there. We don't even worry about why those tools are being asked of us. And I think we can no longer do that. It's very clear that, even a simple, let me give you a simple example. And this has nothing to do with technology, right? So ramps, ADA mandated ramps for people with, in wheelchairs and who have mobility issues. You could think of it as a solution that only helps people with disabilities. And it's true, it does help people with disabilities. But every time you're lugging a large suitcase up a system, and you can take the elevator because it has to be there in a New York subway because it's ADA mandated, everyone is benefiting from this, not just the group that ostensibly this was designed for. If we could have designed those kinds of systems thinking, okay, we are building systems that are going to affect a lot of people. People have all kinds of different needs. How do we reimagine and redesign our technology from the get-go? So we are thinking about access for all and not just access for the most or access for some. That opens up a whole new set of innovations in computer science, a whole new way of designing tools that is a bit more sensitive to what people need. I mean, we've had fields like human-computer interaction. We've had people-centered computing. We've had these concepts for a while. We need to, I think, go beyond human-centered and individual-centered to people-centered and society-centered computing to build assistants that actually help us do what we want to do, as opposed to building systems that are making profits for some companies that we sort of shoehorn ourselves into. So that reimagine and redesign, I think, is a way for computer science to be useful as opposed to fighting and playing on the defensive. And I think that's really important. I think it's been important to identify all the places where we need to fix errors in technology, but we have to think positively about the future as well. We can't just be playing defense. And that's, I think, the core of what I would like the center to represent, not just issues of responsibility, which are very important, but also a better future.
What might that actually look like? Is it essentially talking to lots of stakeholders and designing systems? It must be something more than that. So what in practical terms are you thinking about?
So that's the thing, right? I mean, it's hard to give individual, because every example looks so different and looks so distinct, right? So and there's only so many things I can talk about right now that we're still doing work in progress. We haven't got papers out yet to talk about yet, so I don't want to sort of indicate vaporware where it doesn't exist. But I think something as simple, I mean, you mentioned stakeholders, but it is an important point, right? We did a workshop last year where we were trying to hear from community partners and what they want from technology. And there was a constant refrain of, we want more joy. We want to be able to use technology to help us build that. So sometimes it involves just not being the lead, but sort of standing back and helping others craft their vision of what technology can do for them and helping them build it. And yes, so it does involve a lot of stakeholder engagement, but it's not stakeholder engagement to say, okay, we have this product, we want to know what you think of it. It's more like, oh, you said you wanted to do this thing. How can we help you? How can we help you build what you want? And how can we help that, scale it? I mean, there's, I think of, for example, the work that folks are doing, building, machine translation and NLP tools for processing the Maori language, which was an effort that was done very locally within New Zealand, with a local group that wasn't hooked up to OpenAI or hooked up with these larger companies, but that was done with stakeholder engagement and has produced a tool that's very, very helpful for people who need it in the way that they want it. And I think we can do more of that, and that'll actually help us do better computer science as well. So I'm still figuring this out, exactly what this looks like. I think we're working on individual projects with different groups. Stay tuned.
Yeah. Well, it would seem like potentially generative AI offers some of that opportunity, because now it's not just a matter of, I want to build this product or this system, let me get a bunch of data scientists to go and work on it. It's, I talk to the machine and tell it what I want.
Yeah, except who built the machine? I think you're right. I think there is a new set of platforms being created around the use of generative AI. I'm not sure OpenAI should get the benefit of all of this, though. I'm not sure Google should get the benefit of all of this. And then, even for all its openness, I'm not sure Meta should get the benefit of all this. So I'm a little worried about that idea. I think on the one hand, I see the energy and the excitement, and it's really cool to play with, chatbots and play with the GPT-4 and play with ChatGPT itself and sort of see what it can do for you. It's kind of fun. And that fun is important. I just want to make sure we're not contributing to the capture of yet another environment by a few companies who are working very hard to make sure they're locked in and no one else can play. I think they're coming up with, smaller language models, things that anyone can access. Ways, like, for example, National AI Research Resource, having access to compute to build small models that anyone can play with, that would be good. And we should focus on that.
There's also this institutional trust question, right? In that, right now, people are skeptical of big companies, but they're skeptical of traditional intermediaries and governments and other kinds of sources of trust. So, I mean, how can people get the kind of confidence they need in these systems in this kind of environment?
Yeah, that's difficult. And I think I don't want to drown in a sea of negativity either, because that's also doesn't get you anywhere. And I think, a constant suspicion of everything is not a way to live either. We do have to have some level of, if not trust, but at least a suspension of disbelief for a while we play with some tools. I think we need more experimenting. I think we need less hype. We need to be able to. I think if we could filter out 99% of the hype around these tools, we'd be in a place where we could actually credibly evaluate them and think about what they could do for us and what we want. The hype just makes it so difficult that we either jump into the hype and lean into it very heavily, which is, I think, a mistake, or we try to run away from anything to do with these tools, which is also a mistake. And I think so. The first part of rebuilding trust is to recognize that the hype is just that. Is to say, if we ignored the hype, what can we do with an LLM? What can it do individually for us? And then learn from that. I'm being very wishy-washy here. I don't have a good answer for you, to be honest. But the first step is to separate the hype from the tools. And that's really important.
No, absolutely. And we've got to take the first steps in order to get to the next steps. It's
yeah. But I also struggle with the issue of trust, because I find myself reflexively distrusting some of the claims made about LLMs, when perhaps even I shouldn't be doing that. I should at least take them at face value to a degree. But we don't really have good methodologies. We don't have rigorous frameworks. We don't have what I would call strong scientific evidence for so many of the claims made by LLMs, that there's a constant eye roll, like, oh my God, here's another paper making a claim that tomorrow will be disproved. And you just have to kind of ride those waves a little bit.
No, absolutely. Incredibly challenging, but also incredibly important. Suresh, thank you so much. It's been a really wonderful conversation.
Thank you very much.
This has been The Road to Accountable AI. If you like what you're hearing, please give us a good review and check out my Substack for more insights on AI accountability. Thank you for listening.